KCBS presents Harv Morgan, Contact. All right, let's have the next call. 982-7012. Go ahead, you're in contact, sir.
Mr. Liebeler.
Yes.
I'd like to direct my questions primarily to you.
Yes.
On September 25 or 26 of 1963, two Cubans and an American visited Mrs. Odio in Dallas.
Yes.
One of these Cubans was known as Leopoldo, the other one possibly as Angelo, and the American was introduced as Leon Oswald.
Yes.
The following day, Leopoldo phoned Mrs. Odio and said that the American, namely Leon Oswald, had suggested assassinating the president. Now, I have three questions. Number one, do you think that this person introduced as Leon Oswald was in fact Lee Harvey Oswald, or do you think it was someone impersonating him? And number two, let's see, I forgot my second question.
Well, he's asked the question to me, but of course he's articulated a sub-assumption here that we'll have to deal with first.
Well, you're going to answer it, Jim, as well. I appreciate that.
Go ahead.
All right. Number two.
The question is, was this person who was introduced as Leon Oswald actually Oswald or somebody impersonating him? That's probably the second question, isn't it? Somebody impersonating him?
No, that was still the first question.
All right.
The second question is, regardless of which is the case, does this not suggest a conspiratorial relationship, at least peripheral to, if not directly connected with the assassination? And number three was in connection with a memorandum prepared by Hubert and Griffin for the CIA concerning Ruby and his associates and so on. And one of the men listed there was a Leopold Ramos Ducos. I'd like to know if this was Leopoldo, because it mentions under his name concerning the Odio incident. It also mentions something in connection with Ruby's connections with the anti-Castro group and procurement of arms. This seems to refer to the Nancy Rich testimony, although there's no reference in her testimony to Leopoldo.
Well, now you're talking about a preliminary memorandum that Griffin and Hubert prepared. It was actually in February or March.
Yes.
And, of course, Mrs. Odio's testimony hadn't been taken at that time, nor had the testimony of Mrs. Rich, so there's no possibility of cross-reference at that point, unless they had the investigative reports in front of them. Which they
I presume they had FBI reports at that time.
All right. Now, the first question is whether it was Oswald or someone else.
Yes.
I'm not convinced that in fact, there was anybody in Sylvia's department, as she stated. That's point one.
Well, you think, then, that Mrs. Odio either imagined this incident, as did also her sister, even though Manuel Rye said that she was a reliable person?
Just a moment, sir. Let's get the answer now.
Who said she was a reliable person?
Manuel Rye.
Yeah.
As well as several other people.
I said I'm not convinced that anybody came there, but I'm inclined to believe Mrs. Odio's testimony in certain respects. And let me be more precise. I'm not convinced that there was anybody there who was introduced as Leon Oswald. Period. I'm not convinced there was anybody that was introduced as Leon Oswald, because Annie Lee Odio did not testify to that, did she?
You mean Mrs. Odio's sister?
Yes, Annie Lee.
I don't recall if she did or not.
No, she didn't. She said that there were three people came there, and Sylvia said that one of them was introduced as Leon Oswald.
They both identified him as Lee Harvey Oswald.
Oh, yes. They both said they thought that it resembled pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald. I took, this is, as you probably well know, I took Mrs. Odio's testimony. And spent considerable time discussing this with her in Dallas. I don't think that Lee Oswald was there. For many reasons. Basically, because it was almost impossible for him to have been there as a physical matter. He was in transit at that time from New Orleans to Mexico City and crossed the border. You're probably familiar with the time sequence.
Yes, I noticed a tight schedule there.
Very tight schedule. It would have been almost impossible. Now, if he'd have got on an airplane and gone from New Orleans to Dallas, he could have done it. But
couldn't they have driven?
The airline manifest for that, and there was no indication.
Couldn't they have driven from New Orleans, as the men said they did, or as Mrs. Odio said they said?
Pardon?
Couldn't they have driven from New Orleans, as Mrs. Odio said that they said they did?
They would have had to have moved very rapidly to do so. And then Oswald was later seen on a bus, and it was identified as having been on a bus and crossed the border into Laredo. And in order to have gotten on that bus, obviously he would have had to have bought a bus ticket from Dallas, and there was no indication. We checked the bus sales of bus tickets in Dallas, and there was no indication. In fact, it was quite clear that no bus tickets had been sold from Dallas to Laredo or Mexico City that night. Now, I suppose you can make the hypothesis that he bought a bus ticket for somewhere else and then got off and bought another ticket, but and how far do you pursue these things? But in any event, no bus tickets were sold in Dallas to either Laredo or Mexico City at that time.
Okay, sir. Thank you for calling. And
all of it. Oh, well. All right. Thank you for calling. We've just started to discuss this question.
All right, go ahead.
Go ahead. It's your move.
Oh, my move. Well, then your answer to the first part of it is that.
Do I think it was Oswald? No, I don't think it was Oswald.
And you don't think he was introduced as Leon?
Pardon?
You don't think he was introduced?
There was nobody else impersonating him because that whole notion seems to me falls on his face. This was at the end of September, which is over 2 months before the assassination. And anybody that would be going around impersonating Oswald in Sylvia Odio's apartment at that point, I can't imagine any conceivable purpose that would be served by that.
No, and there was no notion that the president was even coming to Dallas at that particular day.
It had been in the paper on September 13, I believe.
Well, I think that's right. But the fact of the matter is that the notion was at that point that Oswald was going to be in Cuba. Isn't that right?
That's right.
That's what he was proposing to do. He was going to go to Cuba and stay there. So how are they trying to inculpate or frame somebody in Dallas on November 22nd when there was no notion? In fact, the whole notion was contrary. But Oswald was not going to be in Dallas on November 22nd. He was on his way to Cuba.
Well, purportedly, anyhow.
Anyhow, that's right. I mean, it was purportedly, that's what he told his wife. He went to Mexico City. He went to the Soviet embassy and tried to get to Cuba. He went to the Cuban embassy and tried to get to Cuba. And I mean, there's 3 different confirmatory events here involved in his attempt to get to Cuba.
Well, there are other arguments to raise there, but how about the last part of it concerning Leopold Ramos Ducos?
Well, what about Leopold Ramos Ducos? He was involved. Wasn't he a character involved in the anti-Castro operations at one point or other? I'm not really that familiar with that aspect of it.
Well, I don't know either. I've only seen reference to him in this one place, and of course all the FBI reports are not indexed. It says here that his life was threatened by a person suggesting that the same group that would kill Ducos had been responsible for getting rid of Kennedy.
Well, who said that?
Apparently he did. This is in this memorandum to the CIA. I quoted from that.
Oh, that was the one, the Griffin-Huber memorandum?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm just not that familiar with this fellow Ramos Ducos. I checked out the story from the Odio end, and I didn't run across, as far as I can recall, his name from that end of the story.
Well, okay, then was Leopoldo ever identified?
No, he wasn't. And you're familiar with the rest of that story, I'm sure.
The 3 people the FBI thought may have been involved and then turned out not to have been.
That's right. But the commission had concluded, on the basis of other evidence, that Oswald had not been there at that time. Now, I'll go a step further with you. Even if Oswald had been there, and I don't think he was, but even if he had been there, the next question is, what's that got to do with the assassination of the president 2 months later? And I'm at a loss to make that leap, even if I'm willing to admit, which I'm not, and I'm honestly not. I really don't think Oswald was there, and I went into great detail with Mrs. Odio on this question. I think she has her own problems and her own motivations for this story. But what would this have to do with the assassination in any way?
Well, you think she has something to gain by telling this story?
Yes, I do.
Let's get back to that. What would this have to do with the assassination, sir, in your mind?
Well, allegedly, this Oswald, this, of course, is third-hand information, but allegedly he had suggested assassinating the president, so there was something there, and also that he did have certain affiliations with other people and activities getting arms to go to Cuba.
No, this had nothing to do with arms to Cuba.
Yes, I believe it did.